On in and find yourself a comfortable spot, or even find an uncomfortable one. Just find a spot. That's right. Of course, if it's your spot, it's going to be comfortable, right? All right, we are continuing our look at the book of Daniel, the prophecies that are found there, the dreams, the visions that are found there, all point to a pattern. We're going to look at that in our final week before we finish up the quarter, and just kind of look at what everything points to, because there is a consistent pattern. It is a sequence of revelations, a sequence of messages that are pointing to a God who is sovereign over all. He is sovereign over individual lives, such as Daniel, but he's also sovereign over the affairs of nations and the lives of kings, such as King Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, and now we're going to see moving into Cyrus and ultimately to King Darius, or Darius, however we want to pronounce that. We'd accept both of them. But today we're going to continue kind of picking apart the chronology, because it's always important. Anybody that reads Daniel from beginning to end and reads the 12 chapters sequentially, if you are aware and look at history, have a knowledge of history, some of it appears inconsistent. And so what a lot of the critics of the Bible do is say, well, see, that's just a horrible history. Because this couldn't be this way. It makes this statement about this king, and then it makes this statement about this king. We've already seen how the death of King Belshazzar precedes two of his visions. Well, he doesn't die and then have a couple of visions. He has the visions and then he dies. And so we understand, we look at this, that Daniel is historically accurate. But it is not a chronology. You're not looking at it sequentially in these 12 chapters. So what we saw chronologically, and the way we've addressed this, is chapters 1, 2, 3, 4. They're in chronological order. But then it's chapter 8, chapter 5, chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 5, and then chapter 6. And that's where we went last week. So that's the first ones. What about the final four? What about these last four chapters? And one thing that I've learned about any study of the Old Testament, and certainly to a degree in the study of the New Testament, sometimes questions like this just simply depend on who you ask. And there are people that are convinced of things historically, and there are people that will give those good reasons. So sometimes you just have to pick a spot and run with it. We're going to do that. But we're going to look at a little bit of this, and I'll give you the reason for why we're going to do what we're going to do today, and what we're going to look at today. So today we're going to be in chapter 11. Why chapter 11? Why are we going to jump from chapter 6 to chapter 11 and looking at this? Well, we get into a couple of things here. Right off the bat, looking at chapters 10 and 11. Usually, these chapter breaks, the visions, etc., are preceded by some version of what the Old Testament uses called a king's list. In the case of Isaiah, the very beginning verse tells of a sequence of kings. Well, these chapters orient us into the history, and they tell us, like in this one, in the 3rd year of King Cyrus. Well, we go to secular history. We know when Cyrus began. We count 3 years, and we know that this is the year, this is the time that this occurred. So it gives us some historical orientation here. But what we find in chapters 10 and 11, we have the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia. And then in 11, in the 1st year of Darius or Darius the Mede. We looked the last couple of weeks at who is Darius the Mede. Is he different than King Darius of the Medo-Persian Empire? And the answer to that is yes. It's easily determinable. from the clues, the information that we find in the Bible here. All right, so Cyrus was king of the empire. But he had appointed Darius the Mede, or Darius the Mede, as the king over Babylon. So he's a king under a king. That's what an empire is, a collection of kingdoms. Here is one of those kingdoms. So that gets these two men here. Richard.
Where was Cyrus at? Babylon was one of the leading cities in that empire.
But it was a conquered city, and in Cyrus's mind and his mindset, it was a minor thing. It was simply one of a collection of kingdoms for him. He didn't reign in Babylon. He put Darius the Mede there. And so Cyrus was a Persian, and this was in Mesopotamia.
Oh, okay. So of course, I wonder where Cyrus was as far as where he reigned from.
Right. He is over in modern-day Iran, in Persia. All right, so the question then becomes, was the third year of King Cyrus earlier than the first year of Darius the Mede? We don't care, maybe your answer, and that's fine. If that's your answer, take the Bible information for the sake of the Bible information and go. I'm sorry, I can't do that, so y'all just have to bear with me for a couple seconds. We're going to pick it apart a little bit and try to understand it. Well, in his first year as the emperor over the entirety of the Medo-Persian Empire, Cyrus appointed Darius the Mede as king and governor over Babylon. So that's the sequence there. Chapters 11 and 12 are sequential. If you'll notice, there's no indication of any kind of a time change at the beginning of chapter 12. And in fact, it says, now at that time. So it's a continuation of what's going on in chapter 11. So we can kind of take 11 and 12 and put them together, and we're going to study them that way. And then we have to figure out about chapters 9 and chapters 10. So we're going to look at that for just a second. Here's chapter 9 and verse 1. We looked at it last week a little bit. This is not Darius the Mede. In fact, it tells us right there in the text that it's not. In the first year of Darius the son of Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus, if you recall, was King Xerxes. He was the one who married Esther. And so this is later in this. This comes after King Cyrus. This sequentially is something that is now going to have to be placed earlier than chapter 11 and chapter 12. So we have 9 that we find is one of the latest ones there. So this is the Emperor Darius, or Emperor Darius that is here. This is not Darius the Mede. And so that's who we're looking at here. Now comes a big issue. And this is one of those things you just got to figure out where you want to start. And it's in a lot of ways, it's biblical pin the tail on the donkey. You've just got to decide what it is that you want to go with and go with it. It ultimately doesn't make any difference in the message. And that's something that's important to understand when we have to do this. Well, in chapter 11 and verse 1, where it says in the first year of Darius the Mede, in the Hebrew text, the Masoretic text, one of the most precise, correct, accurate texts passed down through the ages that we find, it reads Cyrus. But when the powers that be decided they wanted to translate the Hebrew Bible into Greek, and they gathered scholars together to do just that and produced a body of work called the Septuagint, an Old Testament translation in the Greek language. It reads Darius or Darius. Oops. Is this God's problem? No. Is this man's mistake? Absolutely. Some scribe, somewhere, somebody goofed. It happens when you're doing this, when you're copying stuff repeatedly over time. Sometimes a name or sometimes a number gets messed up. And this is one of those cases. Which one is definitive? Well, what we find later is that when they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, that you find more support for this being Cyrus, king of Persia. Does it matter? No. Is it going to occur basically at the same time? It's the same point in history. It doesn't change the message there. Again, they served together. They served at the same time. And so there's very little difference between the third year of Darius the Mede and the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia. So I've now spent 10 minutes talking about something that I then tell you doesn't matter. So, I just wanted you to be aware of what the issues are and trying to pick this apart, put it back together, and get to the meat of the message. But for our purposes here in this class, we're now going to look at these last 4 chapters, chapter 11, chapter 10, chapter 12, and chapter 9. And so we'll look at them that way just to get with a flow of that message and try to determine what's going on. So we're going to pick this one. We're going to look at Daniel chapter 11 and 1, and we are going to look at Darius the Mede, who is now 62 years old, as we learned earlier. This is 539 BC, and Babylon has just fallen to the Persian Empire. But then we immediately come into something else that scholars are going to fuss about and try to figure this out. Look in the first verse there. As for me, the question is, who's me? In the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood up to confirm and strengthen him. Who is I? There's a lot of people that believe, because we're talking about angels later here. Michael is mentioned specifically. There's a lot of people that believe that this is the angel Michael. We find him in chapter 10 and verse 21, which is right there toward the end. The verse that immediately precedes this. Is he continuing this? Chapter 12 and verse 1, he's mentioned again. There he is in the midst of all of this. Is that him? Or is this going all the way back to Daniel chapter 6? If you remember, we left off in chapter 6 last time. So if this is sequential, go back to the end of chapter 6, see what the antecedent for that might be. And it says there in the last verse of chapter 6, so this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. That's the exact time frame we're looking at. So if you put this in sequential order, and we go from chapter 6 to chapter 11, it says, so this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus, king of Persia. And as for me, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood to confirm and strengthen him. So that leads you to believe it's Daniel speaking. Again, does it matter? Who's ultimately speaking here? God is speaking here. This is a prophecy. This is a relating of a vision for the information given to the Hebrew people and then ultimately to us. So that's kind of where we start with a lot of questions. But what is it now going to talk about? This is perhaps the most power-packed, prophecy-filled chapter in all of Scripture. It is going to reveal in intimate detail a sequence of events and a sequence of kingdoms that is going to span from the exile to right before Christ comes. And when we finish out the book of Daniel, what we're going to find, and when we get to our recap, is that starting with the exile, God is going to reveal all of the kingdoms that are going to come between Nebuchadnezzar and Rome, that he's going to establish that in the days of Rome, I'm going to establish my eternal kingdom. Messiah is going to come, and there's going to even be a prophecy of 70 weeks that's going to pinpoint when Jesus is going to come. It's going to nail it. It's going to nail it down tight. The precision is astounding. And yet people take these prophecies and they will take them and go, no, this is talking about the end of time. And that is a mistake that we should avoid. And the way that we can, I believe, know as much as a human being can know the revealed mind of God is to look at what the fulfillments could be, and then make our decision, is this what was most likely the message given to the Hebrew people? And I think that that's where this falls. I think you have the same approach to the book of Revelation. Would it be encouraging to a Christian in Ephesus to read the book of Revelation, the letter that came from John, about events that are going to happen 2,000 or more years in the future, or is this something that's going to start happening to him in his lifetime? Which is more important? The same is true of these Hebrew people. They're lost adrift in exile. And what they're being told here in Daniel is that the God who is sovereign over nations is going to maneuver things to put them back into the Holy Land, into their land that has been set apart for this purpose, back into Jerusalem, back there to await the coming of Messiah. And there's going to be Babylon, there's going to be Medo-Persia, there's going to be Macedonia, Greece, and there's going to be Rome. And in the days of the Roman kings, that's when God's going to do his master work and bring Messiah. That's the message of the book of Daniel. So if we look at it in that context and see, does the history fit the prophecy? Notice the order that I said that. Because if God's word is truth, then that must dictate the way that we look at it. If it doesn't fit, then it's not that the prophecy's wrong, it's that my interpretation's wrong. And I think we need to give deference to the Word of God if we can find ways, logical ways for it to fit. And that's what I think we're going to find here. All right, so now we made it all the way to verse 2. This is great. Somebody, you can hear another voice out here instead of just mine. Somebody read Daniel 11 and verse 2.
Okay. And now will I show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the fourth shall be far richer than all. And when he is...
No, go ahead, I'm sorry.
When he is waxed strong through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece.
All right, we have 2 countries mentioned here. What do we have mentioned? Persia and Greece. Okay, so now if this prophecy is about something that is still in our future, then we have to look at this and figure this out and figure out how this is going to apply to that. It started out, I'm going to show you the truth, all right? So our weight is going to go with God's word. But now we're going to look. There is Persia that is intimately involved in their daily lives. That's their new overlords. You had the Babylonian captivity took Judah out of Israel and planted it in Babylon. Now you have Babylon has been defeated and Persia has taken over. The next of these kingdoms that is going to arise, according to all these visions, is Greece. So now you've got Persia and Greece that are mentioned in this prophecy here. Is it more likely that this is a prophecy of things that were going to happen in the centuries right after and during the exile? Or is this something that's going to take place 2,500, 2,600 years in the future and counting? Well, I would say that logic dictates, the text dictates, history dictates, all of these things dictate that this is talking about something that's going to occur here. All right, so you have 3 more kings. Well, who's the current king? Cyrus. If you want to look at it as the king of Babylon, then it's Darius the Mede. And then 3 kings came right after them. We've looked at the history of this. We won't go into all that if you want to reflect back on several lessons. But history tells us that Cambyses, Smerdis, and Darius Histopes were the ones that came after them. That was King Darius or Darius that comes there. And then comes the big boy. Then comes Xerxes. Then comes the guy that we always think about when we think about collisions in history between the Persians and the Greeks. Might this be the easiest interpretation, the most logical interpretation, and the one that had more benefit, more information for the Hebrew people who were in exile and were awaiting a return? Absolutely, positively. Obviously this fits. And obviously this is what is going on in this vision. It's just telling us about these guys. Those 3 guys in the middle, inconsequential. None of them had comma the Great after their names, like Cyrus, like Xerxes, or like Alexander. They were just incidental to history. They were the so-sos. There was nothing fascinating about them. And so history and prophecy just passes over. There's going to rise 3 kings, but then there's going to come a guy who's going to arise. A mighty king will arise who will rule with great dominion and do as he wills. And that fits him perfectly. We drop back to Esther. You may remember there was a party going on. He wanted his wife to dance for all of his noblemen, and Queen Vashti, for whatever sense of morality, indignation, or whatever, refused it, which opened the door for him to take another wife who became Esther. But in that narrative, talking about Ahasuerus or Xerxes, we find out that he ruled over 120 provinces. He reigned over an empire that stretched from India all the way down into Africa to Ethiopia. This was a bad man. This guy ruled a massive empire. It was bigger than Babylon, but it was not wealthier than Babylon. Thus the head of gold and the chest of silver. It was powerful. And that's what he was. Incidentally, it's not something that is a part of the prophecy here, but he was a co-regent for a while with his father for 5 to 9 years, and then he reigned solo for 12 to 16 years. He accomplished a lot. But the thing that he should be remembered for is he got whooped. He got defeated. Here, he rose up and went against Greece, but who won? Greece. And it opened the door for Alexander the Great. So we find this history that is being told here. He started out intent on conquest. Now, you want to hear arrogance? Here's arrogance. These are the words of Xerxes. He had called this meeting, and one of the guys wrote down everything he said, and it was preserved. But he's telling all of his commanders, he's telling his princes, he's telling all of his underlings, this is what I'm about to do. I am going to go, and we are going to defeat the Greeks. We're going to take them out, and then we're going to conquer all of Europe, so that the boundaries of my empire will be God's own sky. This guy has a big head. He's got big plans. And that's the king that is being talked about there. He was mighty. He was wealthy. But he was not going to accomplish what he thought he should accomplish. Incidentally, he also called himself King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Has anyone ever heard that phrase before? Who does it apply to? It applies to God. It applies to Jesus Christ. And so we find this guy very arrogant. And there's going to be a prophecy of his defeat. Now, if you think about the sequence of all of this, when you have the Hebrew people, some of whom were still alive, Daniel was still alive when Xerxes takes the throne. And you see all of this power, all of this might, all of this conquest there, and God said he's going to lose. Does that get your attention? Of course it does. Did the book of Revelation get the attention of the Lord's church when it said, hey, this Roman Empire that's over you, they're going to lose? Would that get your attention? Absolutely. What does it put in the human mind? God is in control, not the king. He is the king over kings. He is the Lord over lords. And these earthly kings that are here, they are in submission to God whether they realize it or not, whether they acknowledge it or not. Thus the need for this prophecy here. Not something that's going to occur 2,700 years in the future. Something that was going to occur in their own lifetime. It was going to begin unfolding. So Xerxes boasted of a 5 million man army. How many do we have in the U.S. military combined forces today? Anyone have a guess? It's not 5 million. We had, I believe, if I'm correct, at the end of World War II, we had 8 million men under arms, fighting in 2 theaters around the globe, basically. 8 million men. This dude had 5 million. But it's kind of a little bit of a boastful exaggeration there. It includes all of his cooks, all of his logistical support, a healthy number of prostitutes to keep the soldiers happy, laborers to help build bridges and move things along, and also he took his harem with him. So he included all those in that 5 million, but it was still an astonishingly large army. Like, who can beat this guy? Nobody can beat this guy. Well, there's prophecy right here in Daniel saying he's going to lose. He ran into some very stubborn people when he showed up in Greece. One of the most amazing victories in all of human history was at the Battle of Thermopylae. There was no way that they should have won there. Now, it was a Pyrrhic victory because the 300 were sacrificed. But they ended up losing that battle. Xerxes comes back and is defeated once and for all. But it was by far the largest army on earth. That's who this mighty king is that's being talked about. He ran into, when he went and made his final push there, his massive navy that was 4-1 in ships over the Greek or Macedonian navy got sunk where it floated out there in off the shore in the Sea of Salamis. Basically, the Greeks went into a little place in their home waters where they could condense the size. The massive navy that came against them couldn't quite get at them, and they sunk them all. The whole Persian navy goes to the bottom of the ocean because of those little old Greeks. Well, suddenly God's own sky is kind of shrinking a little bit, and Xerxes is having trouble. Then his army got defeated in succession. Battle of Thermopylae has happened in a previous excursion. Now we have 2 military defeats, and all of a sudden this army is destroyed. And now it goes back to Asia Minor. Now it's going to go back down into Syria. And he's struggling at home trying to explain to people how the King of Kings and Lord of Lords got beaten by just a few Spartans and Athenians over there, and why their massive navy is now at the bottom of the sea. So he leaves behind this army in Macedonia to control people, and Alexander raised an army that defeated that army, and then he went chasing them home. And the next thing you know, Alexander has an empire that has taken over the Persians. All of this is historical fact, is what is going on right there. Somebody then read, with all of that in mind, somebody read verses 3 and 4.
Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion, and do as he wills. And as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided towards the 4 winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, nor according to the authority with which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others besides these.
All right, so now another king will rise. So you're being told then in this very short order, whether it's by Daniel or by an angel, God is revealing this to people, that there's going to be the king that is, and there's going to be 3 other kings after him, and then there's going to be a mighty king. But then after him, there's going to be another king that's going to arise, Alexander the Great. He's the one that defeated the Persian Empire. And in that succession that we've seen all along, from the golden statue, the head of gold, Babylon, the chest of silver, Medo-Persia, and then the thighs and loins of bronze, Greece, Macedonia, Alexander the Great. And below that, the feet that are iron mixed with miry clay, the Roman Empire. The succession of 4 empires that would flow. All of this is confirming that. This is what's happening. This is what's flowing through history. But he was very young when he conquered. He was very young when he died. And when he died, his kingdom was divided into 4 parts. That's already been prophesied in the book of Daniel. Now we're told that it's going to divide it toward the 4 winds here. And it's not going to go to Alexander II. It's not going to go to his posterity. He's not going to be able to pass this down to his child. He didn't have children. He was still young. He inherited the kingdom from his father Philip of Macedonia, but he was not able to do that. So it goes to his generals. It's divided up among these guys, and is going to then dictate the history of Judah. It's going to control the history of God's people until Messiah comes. That's why this is important. That's why they're getting these prophecies here. So Alexander the Great, how did he do what he did? He was an amazing guy. Of all the people in history that should be called the Great, Alexander's the guy. He was a young man. I was focused on things that were, let's say, of a much smaller scope when I was 23. And I wasn't conquering the largest empire that man had ever seen there. Well, Alexander started off not saying, hey, I'm going to conquer an empire whose boundaries are God's own sky. He went, there's a Persian army in our land. We need to beat those guys. And either they're going to come at us again, or we can attack them. And he thought that the best defense is a good offense, and so he attacked. He invaded Persia, starting with Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, with an army of 34,000. How big was the Persian army before they got whooped in Greece? 5 million. All right, they didn't kill all 5 million. This is still the largest army on earth, and Alexander goes after them with 34,000. Any volunteers for that mission? Can you imagine what that pep talk looked like? But yet these guys were solid soldiers. Go ahead.
Solid soldiers is an understatement. These people were cultured. If you came out in birth under weight, under strength, based upon the elders of the villages that raised the Greek culture, you were left on the rocks.
Right.
Literally, they wanted the finest of the fine, and then you went into military service. That was life, literally.
Yes.
You might have had a wife, but you had other things among the men because they were just so tightly bound together to one another. So
Absolutely.
300 marched out there. It was all pride. It was all puffed up because they knew they were that bad.
Yes, and they proved it.
Yeah.
And this army was astoundingly successful. And they conquered so much of this. All right, so 334 BC. We're still looking at 300 years or more before Messiah comes. But we're now moving into that third of 4 empires that Daniel earlier interpreted a dream and said this is what's going to happen in history. It's now unfolding. Now we have more detail about those same things. So he defeated 400,000. Just for the math majors, which one's more, 34,000 or 400,000? Just make sure you're paying attention. 400,000 is pretty stout. This was the remnant army that was there. This wasn't the totality of the Persian army there. But he conquered Phoenicia, which is just north of Jerusalem. And he besieged Tyre. And if you look at Ezekiel and you look at Isaiah, there are prophecies there about Tyre and about the king that was there. And they had a little island off the coast where they had a fortress, and Alexander the Great besieged Tyre and ultimately defeated the undefeatable city of Tyre, and he was just getting started. I mean, it was an amazing military conquest. He was a brilliant strategist, and he didn't win by mass formation. He won by maneuver. He was a chess player against other kings that were playing checkers. And he got into the best position on the battlefield on that day, and he won and defeated armies that were much larger than his own because he was a better general. And he conquered quickly. And he conquered Egypt and Babylon. He conquered the citadel at Susa, Persepolis, and the other Persian strongholds, and all of these 120 provinces that Xerxes ruled over. He even conquered a couple of Russian provinces here and ended up taking a Bactrian wife to consolidate some of his gains there. And then he went as far as Punjab province in India, and his general said, you know what? I think we're done. I think we've conquered enough. Alexander was ready to go. But his men, his leaders, they said, no, this is enough. Look at your map, and India is a long, long way away from Greece. We started out, all you wanted to do was kick these guys out of Greece, and you didn't stop until you reached India. Alexander had big ideas, and he backed it up. But that's the great king that comes after Xerxes. Well, he only reigned for 12 years. And then when he died at a young age, his empire was divided initially among 8 generals. It boiled down to 4. And these 4 generals, the 4 parts of this, none of them were his offspring. But these guys took these successor kingdoms to the Macedonian Empire and ruled over them. Ptolemy was the one that ruled down in Egypt. He's going to be prominent. Antigonus had a son who was named Seleucus, and so the Seleucids are going to rule basically modern-day Palestine and Syria. And so those 2 are going to come into prominence in the next part of these prophecies. Somebody read verses 5 and 6 for us.
Also the king of the south shall become strong, as well as one of his princes, and he shall gain power over him and have dominion. His dominion shall be great, a great dominion. At the end of some years they shall join forces, for the daughter of the king of the south shall go to the king of the north to make an agreement. But she shall not remain and retain the power of her authority, and neither he nor his authority shall stand, but she shall be given up, and those who brought her, and with him who begat her, and him who was strengthened her to those times.
All right, so what we find then is here the king of the south, the southern of these 4 kingdoms, was Egypt. They were the southernmost in Alexander's kingdom. The Ptolemies was the name of this succession of kings. There were 10 of them total. And now we're talking about Ptolemy the First. And again, the time frame here is about 300 years before Jesus was born. And a lot of these details here won't go. If we went line by line in this sequence of prophecy, we could spend at least a quarter, probably just in chapter 12. It is that detailed. You know, even some of the intricacies and the machinations that are going on here are very detailed, but they are written into secular history exactly as they were foretold in Daniel. Chapter 12 of Daniel is the primary reason, the starting reason, why the critics of the Bible say that this was all written after the fact, and then they lied saying that it was written before the fact. Because if they look at chapter 12, it is so obviously accurate that if they acknowledge that these prophecies are accurate, they would have to acknowledge the divinity of God, and they're not going to go there. And so they have to put this after the fact because these prophecies were fulfilled in minute detail. And again, I ask you the question, is it more beneficial to a Hebrew who is in exile in Babylon with all of this about to come back to find out that this is going to happen in my lifetime or begin happening in my lifetime, or is this something that should be 25, 26, 2,800 years in the future? I think question asked, question answered. These were things that were going to begin unfolding. So we have one of the princes, one of Alexander's princes. This would be Ptolemy's. But under the northern kingdom, the kingdom of the north, Seleucus was the one that began here. He's going to have a great-great-grandson that is going to be a very bad man, a very evil guy. Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV, is the one who would sacrifice pigs on the altar at the temple in Jerusalem. He was the one that was going to forbid temple worship. He is the abomination that causes desolation. And we're going to work our way to him here. A shoot from her roots. There was a political marriage here. An Egyptian princess married Antiochus, the son of the first of the Seleucids there. We find that occurring there in verse 6. And so this marriage between these two was an attempt to keep the peace. It didn't work. There was very little peace among these people that were here. But in fulfillment of all this, basically, Ptolemy III from Egypt, the king of the south, comes up. He defeats Syria. He carries away enormous wealth, robbed them, picked them clean, took it all home, and it ushered in a period of peace, a temporary peace that occurred between the kingdom of the north, kingdom of the south. Now, another pause button here. The premillennialists that believe that all of this is a prophecy of the Antichrist at the end of time look at this and go, oh, king of the north, king of the south, and they will tell you, if you look at it today, they'll say they're going, Vladimir Putin, king of the north, king of the north, king of the north, look, it's happening. Well, we've had kings north of us, empires north of us, we've had empires south of us, all throughout history. But this is being precisely fulfilled during this time. Precisely fulfilled during this time. And again, it's kind of an Occam's razor kind of thing. Sometimes the simplest answer is the right answer. And these fulfillments are precise during this time. All right, so there's a return to war. We're going to jump ahead a little bit. Just understand that there's this back and forth going on between Syria and between Egypt. All right, somebody read verses 17 through 20 for us.
He shall set his face to come with the strength of his whole kingdom, and he shall bring terms of an agreement and perform them. He shall give him the daughter of women to destroy the kingdom, but it shall not stand or be to his advantage. Afterward he shall turn his face to the coastlands, and shall capture many of them. But a commander shall put an end to his insolence. Indeed, he shall turn his insolence back upon him. Then he shall turn his face back toward the fortresses of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and shall not be found. Then shall arise in his place one who shall send an exactor of tribute for the glory of the kingdom, but within a few days he shall be broken, neither in anger nor in battle.
All right, so again, you see that there are very specific prophecies, including the sending of a tax collector, an extractor of tribute here. All of this is verifiable. This again is the Seleucid dynasty here. Antiochus the Great, followed by 5 of his heirs. And number 4 was the abomination that makes desolate, the abomination of desolation. And that's exactly who we're leading up to here. If you look back in verse 16, it says there, he shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his hand. What's the glorious land if you ask a Hebrew? Judah. Absolutely. It's the promised land. This is the land that God gave to us. Yeah, we're in exile right now. But if you ask me what home is the glorious land. And so we've already seen that phrase, that term, that appears in the book of Daniel. So we find now that we're talking about a battlefield and politics swirling back and forth that's going between Syria and Egypt. Syria in the north, Egypt in the south, Jerusalem right smack in the middle. And if you look at all of that, it's the same old story, same old song and dance. All of history is now going through all of this. And we find in verse 21 that there's a reference that is made to the next guy here. In his place shall arise a contemptible person. Compliment? Does that mean like a really good military leader? Nope. Your translation may say contemptible or despicable. Take your pick. Not a compliment, not a good guy. This is Antiochus Epiphanes. This is the guy that we learned about back in chapter 8. This is the guy that sacrificed pigs on the altar. This is the guy that corrupted the priesthood during his reign. This is the guy who tried to Hellenize the Jewish people and get them to turn their backs on their heritage on the law of Moses. He forbade daily sacrifices. He built an idol on top of the bronze altar. He sacrificed the swine there. He compelled the Jews to forsake temple worship. He destroyed the sacred books of the law of Moses there. He even took mothers who would circumcise their sons, and he murdered the moms and the sons. This was not a good man. To call him contemptible, I think, is understating it. He was an evil, evil man. Satan is trying to wipe out the Jews in advance of who coming? Jesus. God had preserved this bloodline through all of this, even brought them out of exile, because there was going to be a son of David who had been promised to them. They were looking for him. Satan is doing his best to wipe them out 150, 160 years before Messiah comes. So now in the intertestamental period, there's rebellions of the Jews, the wars of the Jews. Josephus talks about all the things that were happening here. But that's where we get to in these prophecies. We're going to stop here and pick up in the narrative. But if you look all the way through the end of the chapter, and again, if you want to do some study outside of this, let me know. I'll point you to some good information, literally verse by verse, and sometimes 2-3 times within a verse, you can point to historical people. But all of this is about the workings of Antiochus Epiphanes when he was in the glorious land. It is astounding how much prophecy is in this part of the book. And so we get a little bit of a recap of the things that have already been mentioned there in verses 36 and 37. But all of this that is focusing on this guy, premillennialists will tell you that's the Antichrist. When it is so obvious that it applies to this guy who was a historical figure that did all of these things, that it fulfills in intimate detail all before Christ. All of immediate importance to the Hebrew people. And so it does a violation to the text, it does a violation to the nature of prophecy, and certainly to the historical context to try to force this into a multi-millennial advance in history when right there in front of them you have that full fulfillment. And so all the way through the end of the time, or into the chapter, in chapter 11, it talks about this sequence of events, this political ebb and flow of history all around Judah, all around the exiles that have returned, all the things that were going on right before Jesus comes. And then we're going to see a prophecy that's going to pinpoint in time, the 70 weeks, that's going to tell you exactly when Messiah is going to come. So to take this as something 2,000 years, 2,500 years in the future would be to do violence to the text that is so perfectly aligning with history. And as we'll see when we look at the 70 weeks, the premillennialist has to take this and then introduce a gap in those 70 weeks, introduce a gap of 2,000 years, versus allowing it to say what it says and be perfectly timed and aligned with history, which is more likely that God would do. Well, I'll give you a hint. You know what my answer already is. So with that in mind, we'll press the pause button right here, and we will rejoin this next week. Any thoughts, comments, questions? Any historic scholars or whatever want to chime in? Of course. Okay. But anyway, if you want some additional historical information, I'll be glad to hook you up and show you how this plays out. Read it for yourself. It's an amazing sequence in Scripture. Well, thank you all for being here today. We'll wrap it up for now. Look forward to our time of worship together.